Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Israel Is. And today I continue my series about the historical background of the Palestinian Israeli conflict. These have been a couple of hectic weeks, and that's why there were no uploads. Um, but we'll do a bit of a recap of what happened. Particularly, the latest thing was that um, a second white paper was drafted. Actually, yeah, I think it's either the second or the third. Um, Termed the McDonald's Paper, which essentially put a quota on Jewish immigration to the to mandatory Palestine at a cap of 75,000 for the next, I believe, 5 years. Um, and also, it put it that way that the first year there could be 25,000 immigrants in recognition of the dire conditions of Jews in Europe, and then 10,000 each year thereafter. Um, that aside, there was also a planned partition to, rather, no, sorry, a planned founding of a Arab Jewish state that will be founded essentially 10 years from the penning of the paper, so 49. The Jews rejected the paper in strong terms, and so did the Arabs. And the League of Nations actually saw fit to contact the British about the legality of the McDonald paper. However, this did not occur, and nothing came out of it because of the outbreak of the Second World War. And this is where we stop. And I wanted first to do a little detour and follow in the footsteps of one of our best friends here, one Hajamin al-Husseini, the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who fled in 1937 in the wake of the revolt that he inspired, fearing that the British would arrest him. He fled to neighboring Lebanon, and he had suspicions that the French authorities will extradite him into the hands of the British, and so he fled to Iraq. Iraq was ostensibly independent, but under heavy British influence, but was also very pan-Arabist in its leanings. There was a large amount of pan-Arabic sympathizers there, and the leadership of Iraq thought that by sheltering al-Husseini, they could also keep the more fascist forces in Iraq at bay. And so he actually received a hefty allowance from the authorities. he was very how shall I put it? His reciprocity towards the authorities was a strange one. In essence, he participated in the 1941 pro-Nazi Rashid Ali coup d'etat, the revolt, and the massacre of Jews that that occurred during that coup d'etat. This is an event known widely as the Farhud in Arabic, in which about 140 Jews were massacred. Jewish establishments and homes were destroyed. And this is maybe the beginning of the conflict spilling and being translated into blatant anti-Semitic pogroms against hapless Arabic Jews in Iraq, to begin with, and later on in 45 in Egypt, where there was more property damage, but also a couple of casualties in life. And then also in 1945 in Libya, in Tripoli, where again about 140 Jews were killed, their establishments and houses destroyed. All of this in the guise of supposedly fighting Zionism, but these were not Zionists. These were Jews that lived in those Arab countries. This would eventually lead into the mass both immigration but also expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and Muslim countries. Essentially an ethnic cleansing of the Arab world from Jews, where Jews have lived for 2,000 years, essentially. There is a lot of romanticization of the relationship between Jews and their hosts in Muslim countries. The situation was never peachy. At least, never perfect. There was also there was always a sense of the host population supposedly being superior in status. So that's about that topic, about al-Husseini and his adventures in Iraq. In Palestine, the formal policy by the Haganah leadership was this, that they shall support the British as if there was no white paper, and fight the white paper as if there were no Germans. What that essentially meant that a lot of Jewish volunteers enlisted with the British Army. Al-Husseini remained a leader in exile for the anti-British Arabs. But tensions eased somewhat with his rivals among the Arab population gaining more traction, and they were more peaceable towards the British. So both the Haganah and the Irgun collaborated with the British in light of the war, but a substantial number of Irgun members saw this collaboration as cowardice and treachery in light of the White Paper, and splintered into the Lehi, which was an extremist anti-British organization. Their leader, Avraham Stern, actually proposed, much like al-Husseini, an alliance with the Nazi regime, as he was unaware at the time of the plans for the final solution, and he actually this caused the Lehi to lose a lot of traction with the Jewish inhabitants of the land, and Stern was killed by the British in 1942. In light of news reaching the Allies about the extermination taking place in Europe, the British still remained steadfast about the quota on Jewish immigration into Mandatory Palestine. In some cases, actually turning away ships back to Europe, and also making an effort to stop Jews in Palestine from bribing Nazis with the intent of freeing Jews from Europe. At this point, the Irgun, also following the splintering of the Lehi from the Irgun, decides on changing its stance with regards to collaboration with the British, and its leadership posts the following poster all across the Jewish communities. The White Paper is still in effect. It is enforced despite the betrayal of the Arabs and the loyalty of the Jews, despite the mass enlisting to the British Army, despite the ceasefire and the quiet in the land of Israel, despite the massacre of masses of the Jewish people in Europe. They called the Jews to arms and to renew hostility towards the British authority with the intent of gaining independence for Jews in Israel, or Palestine rather, and the immediate founding of a Jewish sovereign nation in Palestine. And they began with several operations against the British and against Arabs, with the intent of building and consolidating their military power. And at the same time, the Lehi was also carrying out their war against the British. And they managed to assassinate the British minister resident in the Middle East, Lord Moyne, or outside of his house in Cairo rather, in Egypt. This assassination was carried out because of British policy generally, and some of his policy in particular, despite the fact that compared to other British officials in the area, he was a bit more sympathetic towards Jews and saw favorably the idea of a partition of the land, for example, whereas others were opposed to the idea of such a partition. This assassination caused a huge rift between the British and the Jews in Palestine, with, for example, the Labour Party in Britain beforehand to um, remove the white paper limitations on immigration as soon as they are elected, and the assassination caused them to shelf that plan. Um, Also causing Churchill to become a bit colder to the idea of Zionism. This caused the Jewish leadership to essentially wage war on the Irgun and the Lehi. And we enter into an era called the hunting season. In Hebrew, it is known as the saison from French. The Haganah essentially performed counterterrorism efforts against the Irgun, specifically against the Irgun, for whatever reason. I think that the Lehi made promises to stop their aggression for a time being. And what the Haganah did was turn in Irgun members to the British, but also perform unlawful kidnapping of Irgun members. The Irgun refused to fight back, denouncing the idea of a Jewish civil war, and refused to cease their anti-British efforts. With this, we end the first half of the 1940s, and we enter into the most important, maybe, part of the historical background of the conflict, with the end of the Second World War and the founding of Israel. So I'll continue this hopefully next week, and until then, have an awesome weekend.